In 1982, a little-known freshman basketball player by the name of Michael Jordan would take the stage with the North Carolina Tar Heels against the Georgetown Hoyas. The game was neck and neck. North Carolina trailing, Jordan made a shot from the wing with 16 seconds remaining. In one simple move, Jordan had made history. North Carolina took the 63-62 win with the national title. But for Jordan, this play would change his reputation. That was the birth of Michael Jordan. Before that, I was Mike Jordan. In 1984, he'd signed one of the biggest endorsement deals ever offered, with a brand that was relatively new to the basketball footwear market. Wasn't Nike the running shoe company? What about Adidas? What about Converse? We'll get into that, but Nike came through, and in a big way. They offered him his own shoes, $250,000 in cash plus stock, and $1 million in advertising. This was unheard of at the time. Jordan, a huge fan of Adidas, begrudgingly accepted. This deal would change the reputation of Nike and help propel Jordan into superstardom. But before there was Jordan, there was Nastase. And before Nastase, there was Pre. And before Pre, there was a small startup called Blue Ribbon led by a young, introverted yet ambitious founder, Phil Knight. Nike is the story of hustle and hard work. Nike is also the story of incredible marketing and endorsement deals. Nike is what every young entrepreneur dreams of. It was this dream, or this crazy idea as Phil Knight called it, that would take a tiny team of young entrepreneurs from a small upstart to the most dominant name in sports. This is the story of how Blue Ribbon became Nike, signed some of the greatest athletes to ever play the game, and took over the world. This is Phil Knight. In 1962, he was a recent graduate of Stanford's business school and still part of the Army Reserve. Like most people in their mid-20s, he had no idea what to do with his life. But on a run through the hills of Portland, he committed to his crazy idea that he came up with at Stanford. What if you could outsource the manufacturing of shoes to the East, like the camera companies had done? Adidas and Puma were making shoes in Europe, which was expensive. Knight saw this as an opportunity, and that day he committed to it. He persuaded his dad to finance a trip abroad where he'd see the world and hopefully start a shoe company while at it. It was on this once-in-a-lifetime trip that Knight connected with Onitsuka, a company based in Kobe, Japan, producing Tiger brand running shoes. He convinced Onitsuka to give him the rights to sell the shoes in the West and ordered 12 samples. Now keep in mind, Knight had nothing going on at the time. He didn't even have the semblance of a company. To make this deal took a lot of brass. The guys at Onitsuka asked how big Knight thought the company could be. He said an outrageous number, 1 billion. They asked him the name of his company. He came up with Blue Ribbon on the spot. Everyone smiled, shook hands, and the first deal was made. It would take another year before he got the samples, and in the meantime he worked as an accountant. In 1964, with the samples in hand, Knight met with his former track coach at University of Oregon, Bill Bowerman. He was hoping to get Bowerman's endorsement, but instead ended up with a partner. On Bowerman's recommendation, the two split the company 49-51 in favor of Knight. First year sales were 8,000. While the shoes started selling, it would take several years before Knight could pay himself a salary. He put everything back into the business. Blue Ribbon was constantly on the brink of failure in its early days. Then came along Jeff Johnson. He was a tenacious, hardworking, and neurotic young salesman. Johnson was Blue Ribbon's first employee, and he helped create their first brick-and-mortar store. He was obsessive about the Tigers, and he would write Knight a letter almost every day about sales, customer feedback, and even his personal life. Johnson was relentless and helped propel Blue Ribbon to the next level. In 1967, under the guidance of Bowerman, Onitsuka began making the Cortez for Blue Ribbon. The shoe was a hit. It was stable, comfortable, and fixed the cushioning in the midsole that plagued other shoes. The shoe was designed from the ground up for runners, and Kenny Moore logged over 1,000 miles in the Cortez. Now let's talk about Bill Bowerman for a moment. Bowerman was a DIY shoe creator in his day. Bowerman wasn't sales, he certainly wasn't marketing, he wasn't even really a pure endorsement play. He was at his best a tinkerer. He was a running coach who understood the game better than anybody. Perhaps we'd call him a shoe engineer, or maybe even a shoe dog. But at a minimum, this guy had vision. He understood athletes and he understood shoes, and he was relentless when it came to achieving his goals. While Blue Ribbon was steadily growing, it wasn't until the 70s that the brand would really come into its own with Bowerman's influence. When Bowerman saw his wife's waffle maker over breakfast in 1970, inspiration hit. He was looking for an idea to replace the traditional metal spikes worn, and he realized that he could create the pattern he desired with the waffle maker. He began pouring melted urethane into the waffle maker. The machine sealed shut on the first try. Undeterred, Bowerman pushed on. The rubber was too fragile on another try, but after he partnered with a local rubber shoe company, he was able to get a prototype for the shoe down. The shoes left an imprint in the dirt, which was reminiscent of the lunar prints by the American astronauts in Apollo. Thus, the original iteration of the shoe was called the Moon Shoe. But by 1974, after further refinement, the waffle trainer finally came into its own. The timing of all of this was incredible. As Bowerman was designing new shoes, Knight and his team were working their asses off to keep the company afloat. In 1971, Onitsuka attempted to force Blue Ribbon to sell their operation. Blue Ribbon had rapidly grown, but they were still constantly on the verge of insolvency. This move by Onitsuka to close in on their West Coast distributor forced Knight to make some major structural changes. Knight had already had bank issues the previous year, and Bob Woodell's family had given Blue Ribbon a lifeline with an $8,000 check, which was likely the majority of the family's savings. Now with Onitsuka demanding the company, it was time to make some big decisions. He simultaneously brought in another Japanese manufacturer, unbeknownst to Onitsuka. Knight officially declined the takeover bid, and the two companies went to war over the Cortez. Onitsuka eventually lost, and out of the rubble came Nike. The Cortez is the only sneaker to be a bestseller by two companies, Onitsuka, which later became Asics, and Nike. Knight had a brief tenure as a professor at Portland State, where he'd not only meet his wife Penny Knight, but also a young designer named Carolyn Davis, whom he hired to help create some ads. $2 an hour is what he offered for the role. When the time came to create a new logo for Nike, he reached out to Davis and she came up with the iconic design. While it's famously reported she got paid $35 for one of the most recognizable designs in history, the fact of the matter is, Knight didn't even like the original design. Nike wasn't even an official name when she came up with the design. The original shoes they put the logo on were a pair of soccer cleats that were doubling up as football cleats in the States. The original names for the company were Dimension 6 and Falcon. Cue Jeff Johnson. The night before the patent was due, Johnson woke up from a fever dream where he saw the name Nike. Named for the Greek goddess of victory, Johnson felt it was perfect. Knight, on the other hand, still felt dubious of all three names. Unsure of what name to go with, Knight struggled with the decision until the last possible moment. Johnson felt that great companies had two-syllable names that were easy to pronounce with a hard letter in there. Nike fit the bill, and without a better option, Knight submitted it along with the logo for their shoes. Kismet. On May 30th, 1971, Nike became official. That's how a simple logo by a college student and a profound dream by Blue Ribbon's first employee came together to birth one of the most iconic brands in the world. By the way, that designer, Carolyn Davis, she was later given Nike shares for her work that were reportedly worth around $600,000 to $1 million depending on stock price. So don't worry about Carolyn.
Prefontaine arrived at the University of Oregon in 1969 when college campuses were at the center of a changing world. He came as an athlete, but soon came to symbolize much more.
Steve Prefontaine was the golden child of track and field in 1972, particularly for Oregonians. Knight was a huge fan, Bowerman was a mentor to him. The guy had style, he had charisma, and he was a beast when it came to running. During the Olympics held in Germany that year, everything would change.
Good evening. I'm Howard K. Smith in Washington. Harry Reasoner's on vacation. These are tonight's headlines. Israel, mourning its dead and angered at the killers, prepares to hold a state funeral tomorrow for the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany.
Mass Palestinian terrorists took over the Olympic Village apartment for the Israeli athletes. 2 were immediately killed and 9 others were taken hostage. The building over, Bowerman was staying with Pre. Another athlete banged on the door telling them of the gunman, and Bowerman called the United States military. For this, Bowerman would later be reprimanded by the Olympic Committee, although Jesse Owens, the track star of the previous German Olympics, would come to his defense. In total, 11 Israeli athletes and coaches would die. Following this terrible tragedy, Bowerman and Pre were never the same. Bowerman was out. He decided to sell most of his shares tonight, which would still get him to a net worth of around $400 million by the time of his passing. But bigger than that, Nike had lost one of its two founders. Knight also brought on Pre as a sponsor, but the man would die just a few years later in a terrible car accident. The tragedy of the Munich massacre was an important moment in the Nike story. In many ways, this period was the end of one era and the beginning of another. Nike had done what many thought was impossible. They had succeeded in building a legitimate competitor in shoes, but they still had cash problems. The obvious way out of this was to IPO. For many years, Knight and the Nike team had wrestled with the idea of going public, but they feared that the company had become too corporate. This eccentric team of entrepreneurs was worried about becoming the man. They were worried about losing their culture. But without a cash infusion, they'd always be one step away from a death spiral. To help solve for this, Knight created a futures program with retailers. A futures contract meant signing a deal with a retailer for an order 6 months out at a discounted rate and fixed delivery date. This wasn't a normal business practice back then, but it helped ease their cash flow problems. They could create a more predictable income and get cash in their pockets sooner. Knight later said, "Why not go to all of our biggest retailers, tell them that if they sign ironclad commitments, if they'd give us large and non-refundable orders 6 months in advance, we'd give them hefty discounts, up to 7%. While this program was successful, at the end of the day, it always came back to the IPO. They needed cash, and they needed it soon. Still worried about losing control, the Nike team came up with a workaround. The answer? They issued 2 classes of stock, 30 million Class B shares for the normies, and 20 million preferred Class A shares for the team that would allow them to name 3/4 of the board. 30 million shares were held in reserve, while 2 million Class B were actually sold to the public. Phil Knight would retain 46%. On December 2nd, 1980, Nike was set to IPO. Nike and Apple would IPO the same month. On Knight's insistence, the company set an IPO price at $22 per share. By the end of December 3rd, Knight went from a success on paper to being worth $178 million. The guy with a crazy idea, who made only $8,000 in revenue in their first year of business, was now filthy rich. In 1973, Nike's revenue was $28.7 million. By 1983, Nike was pulling in $867 million. You can't explain much in 60 seconds, but when you show Michael Jordan, you don't have to. Following the IPO, Nike was in a much stronger position financially, but they weren't safe from competition. They were the running shoe company. It wasn't until a young collegiate athlete by the name of Michael Jordan came along that they drastically changed their approach to footwear. Jordan wanted Adidas, but Adidas was a mess. The founder and CEO of Adidas, Adi Dassler, had passed. His wife Kath was in charge of the German shoe company, and her health was deteriorating. The company was being managed by the Dassler heirs, and they were struggling to get along. Converse made a pitch, but they already had Bird, Magic Johnson, and Dr. J under their banner. If they gave Jordan a better deal, that could spell disaster for their current roster of sponsorships. In 1984, Nike had its first quarterly loss ever. Nike needed a competitive edge, and Jordan needed a brand deal. Enter the sports agent David Falk. He had a strong relationship with longtime Nike dealmaker Rob Strasser. When Jordan ignored Falk, Falk went around him by reaching out to Michael's parents. Michael went to Beaverton where the Nike team rolled out the red carpet. They played a highlight tape of Michael to the song Jump by the Pointer Sisters. They showed Michael a red and black basketball shoe. Jordan wanted the shoe lower to the ground, like Adidas. Nike said they were happy to oblige. They'd redesigned the shoe with Jordan's input. Nobody was doing that. Nike let the athlete have a major role in the design of their product. Then came the deal. The final offer was $500,000 a year in cash for 5 years. In comparison, the previous highest contract held by James Worth for New Balance was an 8-year deal worth $150,000 per year. On top of that, they added stock options and $1 million in marketing commitment for the first 6 months. There were 3 stipulations. If Jordan didn't win Rookie of the Year, become an All-Star, or average 20 points per game in his first 3 years, Nike could cancel. At the last minute, Jordan went back to Adidas and asked for a similar offer. But once again, Adidas said no. Jordan took the deal. Now let's talk about how this went for Nike. It's hard to understate how big of a deal Michael Jordan was for the Nike brand. Jordan was massive. In his first year in the NBA, he played every game, averaged 28.2 points per game, and won Rookie of the Year. The Air Jordan 1 hit shelves in March of 1985 at the ludicrous price of $65. Oh, what's even crazier? Nike was originally hoping to hit $3 million in sales by year 4. In the first year alone, they hit $126 million. The Air Jordan was famously banned for not fitting the NBA's all-white sneaker rule. Nike paid the fines and ran this.
On September 15th, Nike created a revolutionary new basketball shoe. On October 18th, the NBA threw them out of the game.
There was a slump in year 3 of the Air Jordan, and that's when we get the famous relationship between him and Tinker Hatfield. The shoes rebounded and have continued to be a force of their own. In 2012, Jordan sold $2.5 billion worth of shoes at retail. By 2021, they reported earnings of $4.7 billion, from $126 million to $4.7 billion in annual revenue. To say the Nike-Jordan partnership has been a success would be a massive understatement. Jordan helped bring Nike into the future, and Nike helped turn Jordan into a superstar. The 80s weren't all good for Nike. Reebok came out of nowhere. They created shoes for the aerobics market and were able to sidestep their competitors. It was smart, and it drove huge sales for what was a relatively small brand. By the end of the 80s, Reebok had actually overtaken Nike. Nike had another resurgence in the 90s, but a lot of this was underscored by the human rights abuses in their factories throughout Asia. The sweatshop and Nike became synonymous for a period of time. At first, the brand made some half-hearted attempts to deal with this, but they largely felt like their contractors in Asia were to blame. Wages rose when Nike set up manufacturing. Not to mention, most of Nike's competitors were doing the same thing. Nike just got all the credit. But finally, by the late 90s, Nike had made some major overhauls to how they did business abroad. They raised their wages at their factories, created environmentally safe plants, and improved working conditions. While issues still exist, Nike has definitely worked hard to change the way they do business abroad. It was also in the 80s that Nike made a shift in its approach to marketing. Knight was never a marketing guy. He was always product first. Shoes for runners, by runners. This shift first started to materialize around 1982 when Dan Whedon and David Kennedy left the William Kane advertising agency and took the Nike account with them. They also released their first broadcast commercials in 1982.
And at Nike, we're putting that knowledge to work, making shoes that actually help athletes to run faster and safer. Why do we go to so much trouble? Well, it may be the 20th century and all that, but there are still people out there who run as if their life depended on it.
Together, they created the Just Do It campaign in 1988. Inspired by the convicted murderer Gary Gilmore's last words, "Let's do it," the Just Do It campaign helped take Nike from $877 million in 1988 to $9.2 billion in 1998. Much of Nike's incredible advertising can be attributed to the Whedon and Kennedy partnership. The style, the tone, and much of the feel of what we think of when we talk about Nike can be linked to this partnership. Nike's advertising wouldn't have nearly the value and depth without their sponsorships. It started with the tennis player Ilie Nastase in 1972, but after building out the Jordan brand in the 80s, Nike made it their mission to sign the best. Nike doesn't just sign an athlete, they seek out the greats, and then they follow that athlete for as many years as possible. Let's take a look at the Tiger Woods Nike deal. Nike sponsored Tiger Woods in 1996.
I'm Tiger Woods.
I'm Tiger Woods. I'm Tiger Woods.
I guess hello world, huh?
Tiger Woods was a superstar. He changed the perception of what a golfer looks like. He made this sport cool. He broke new ground as a person of color in a predominantly white sport, but his race wouldn't matter if it weren't for the fact that he was legitimately great. Tiger Woods is the Michael Jordan of golf, and Nike signed him. Tiger was and remains an absolute beast. From 2000 to 2009, he received PGA Player of the Year 8 times. But Nike didn't simply throw a pair of shoes on Tiger and walk away. They backed him and supported him throughout his professional journey. They released golf clubs, golf balls, and shoes. The clubs and balls eventually were dropped in 2016, but Nike didn't stop making golf shoes, apparel, and accessories, and they certainly didn't stop working with Tiger. It's a fairly simple equation, Knight told Bloomberg. We lost money for 20 years on equipment and balls and realized that next year, 2017, wasn't going to be any different. When Tiger Woods' personal life was falling apart, Nike was one of the few brands that stuck around. It paid off. In 2019, Woods sank a putt in the 5th Masters tournament. Apex Marketing estimated $22.5 million in earned media from Woods wearing the swoosh. That's $22 million in value just from the screen time. But bigger than that, they were there for his return to form. They were there when Woods was at his best. They were there at his lowest. And they were there when he came back and kicked butt once again. They got to be a part of that storytelling. Nike has paid hundreds of millions to Tiger, but it's hard to put a number on Nike's return. When they closed up their golf equipment, revenue from Nike Golf was around $706 million. Sponsorships like Tiger's are what make Nike, Nike. Nike has continued to thrive in the digital era. Nike partnered with Apple Fitness in 2006. This relationship has continued to blossom as Apple has added products like the Apple Watch. Nike is the king of hype. They build demand and then push out limited runs of their shoes via their sneakers app, which came out in 2015. In 2021, they acquired Artifact, a virtual goods and NFT company. In general, Nike has gone far more direct to consumer. Nike forecasts that by 2025, over 50% of its sales will be direct to consumer. They've built an avid fan base around their brand. They build hype like nobody else. They've continued to maintain their dominance, and there's no sign of that stopping. It'd be easy to write off Knight and Nike as being in the right place at the right time. But Knight's vision was ahead of its time. He saw the benefits of globalization before the rest of the West had caught on. He understood athletes, brand endorsements, and he was good at putting the right people in the right jobs. Nike has become a part of Americana. It's so much more than one shoe or one athlete. The swoosh is a symbol recognized across the world. Nike hasn't been without its flaws, but as the global economy constantly evolves, so does the brand. Nike is Jordan. Nike is Tiger Woods. Nike is Pri and Nastase, and so much more. Nike is Kismet. It's a story of incredible tenacity and incredible timing. Nike is no longer a brand that represents one sport, one shoe, or one athlete. It's a brand that represents athletics. The brand is a part of American history. It's a story that represents American entrepreneurship. It's the story of the underdog becoming the biggest in the game. Nike is footwear. Nike is sneaker culture. Nike is great advertising. Nike is athletics.